Do you remember where I stopped? The last topic I think I talked about experimental methods of research. Am I right? Please let me know what topics have remained uncovered, or what the last topic I covered was. I think the last topic was experimental methods of research. If I am right, please let me know, or I should find out myself. Do you have my voice? Do you hear me? Right. Did I talk about descriptive methods of research, like survey methods, interrelational methods, developmental methods? All right. So let me start. The other day, I talked about experimental methods of research. And I said that experimental methods of research, in fact, are rooted in, in natural sciences. In human sciences, like in linguistics, applied linguistics, psychology, sociology, it is very difficult to stick to those methods of experimentation because we are dealing with human beings. And human beings are different from inanimate beings. As a natural scientist, you take objects to the laboratory and perform experiments. In human sciences, like in linguistics, you cannot take people to laboratory to perform experiments. If you're going to do some psychological analysis, sociological analysis, you cannot use people as subjects, but you use them as participants in your research. So, you should respect them. You should observe their rights. That's why in social sciences, including linguistics, they go for descriptive methods of research. Not that experimental methods are not used. We also use experimental methods of research. But oftentimes, we go for descriptive methods of research because these methods seem to fit into social sciences, more appropriately than experimental methods. Descriptive methods of research are no less than experimental methods. In fact, they are very important methods of collecting data and making decisions. And there are lots of techniques of this of experimentation, lots of techniques of collecting data. Well, I can classify descriptive methods of research into 3 types: survey methods, interrelational methods, and developmental methods. So 3 types of descriptive methods: survey methods, interrelational methods, and developmental methods. What are survey methods? Survey methods, any idea? Please say something. You have to participate in class activities. Depends on questionnaire. Yes, sometimes yes. In fact, survey methods are the oldest methods of doing research. And they vary in scope and in complexity. They might be very simple. Well, yes, they can also be quantitative. So they vary in scope and complexity. They can be very simple. They can be very complex. They can be very simple, requiring frequencies, for instance, only. They can be very complex, requiring complex statistical investigations. Surveys like school surveys. If you're interested in, for instance, problems in relation to schools, problems of language learning by students in schools, problems in relation to language teachers, problems in relation to the authorities of the school, problems in relation to parents, students, and teacher relationship. All these will fall in the category of survey methods. They are very simple. So you have a large number of students, 200 students in one school, for instance. But when you adopt survey method for your study, you should first know your goals. What are your goals? Then you should decide on the exact methodology. Alright, if you want to use survey, then the question is, how is this to be applied? How is this to be done? For instance, if you want to know about teachers' job satisfaction. Hi. If you would like to know about teachers' job satisfaction, there are different ways to collect data via survey method. You might simply design a questionnaire. You might go and interview these people. Or you might simply indirectly observe people. Like when you plant a candid camera and then you record, teachers chat in the school office. And so they might talk about their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with their jobs. Or you might go to the office and directly listen to their chats about how much they are satisfied with their jobs. All these can be considered as surveys, but the technique of collecting data differs. So through survey methods, you collect different types of information. What information can you collect through survey methods? What information can you collect through survey methods? Yes, related to the subjects. Participants. Use the word participant, please. I said that in natural sciences we use the word subject, but in social sciences we tend to use the word participant, because subject has negative meaning attached to it. So one type of information is information about their gender, about their age, about their race, about their years of education, about income. This information is called facts. These are facts or figures about people which remain stable. Somebody might be, Japanese. Somebody might be, Arabian. Somebody might be Iranian. Somebody might be American, right? These are facts or figures about people. Or one's age. You might, for your research, you might need to know about people's age or gender, male or female, so on. So, a fact is anything that can be verified about these people. Right? Anything that can be verified according to the participants and the materials, yes. Facts can be verified, right? Operationally defined. You define it in your research. What facts, what figures you wish to gather from your participants. Another type of information that you gather from participants is opinions. You go and talk to these people. You collect their opinions. Right? So facts and figures. Opinions. Behavior. You witness, you observe their behaviors in schools, in hospitals, where you collect your data. Right? So it might be important in your research what behaviors they emit, they produce. That might be part of the study. And these behaviors can also be verified. Now, yes, level of education. Level of education is a fact. I mentioned that. It's a fact. Alright, now, what instruments do you use to collect information? Tests. In surveys, no, in survey research we do not use tests. What tools? Right, what tools? Interviews, yes. One instrument is interview. What else? Meeting? What do you mean meeting? Observation, you mean? Right, observation. Observation. So interview, observation, there is also questionnaire. Yes, questionnaire. So interview, observation, questionnaire. But which one do we use? Which one should we use? Can be anyone. Well, these are inventories, you know. These are inventories. Questionnaire, observation, interviews, these are inventories. Depends on our study, exactly. We choose our instrument for data collection depending on the study that you have defined. So you look at what you need, what information you need, and then you choose the instrument that is relevant to your research. You should make sure that the instrument that you use enables you to collect information in the most accurate way that you want. Right? This is very important to make sure, to guarantee that the information that you want is collected via the most appropriate instrument. Sometimes, well, you go for questionnaire. Sometimes you go for observation. Sometimes you go for interview. Well, questionnaires are of different types and kinds. Some questionnaires are well, some questionnaires are, let me just think of questionnaires. Sometimes you send the questionnaires via posts, via emails. Sometimes you take the questionnaire to the school yourself, and then you hand it out among people for you to fill out. But sometimes you have no access to all those people you want them to participate in your research. So you have to post it. You have to send it via your email to those people. Some questionnaires are open-ended. Some questionnaires are closed-ended. If they are closed-ended, so you have questions and options, alternatives. They have to choose from your alternatives that you suggest. Still others are open-ended. You raise questions and they have to answer. Each has its own merits and demerits. This is also true about, well, interviews. There are 3 types of interviews. Do you know them? 3 types of interviews. There are 3 types of interviews. What about the use of materials? What do you mean, material? Well, yes, structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews. Well, structured, what is a structured interview? Yes, interviews can also be direct and indirect. I'll get to that. In structured interviews, you have fixed questions. You do not change questions. And then each person who is interviewed would have the same questions. In semi-structured interviews, you also have fixed questions. But as the interview goes on, you also raise other questions. So you have those, for instance, 2 fixed questions together with some more questions which you raise as the interview goes on. In unstructured interviews, you do not have questions in advance, but you simply approach the interviewee and you start the interview. Then you talk about issues, materials around, the area, and then gradually you make your questions more and more serious. Well, interviews can be direct or indirect. Like when you go to a school or to a hospital to talk to people directly, in person. That is direct. But sometimes this is not possible. You do this via these, digital rooms, for instance. You do this via email. You do this electronically through WhatsApp or whatever. And so you use electronic software applications to get in touch with people. So sometimes it is direct, sometimes it is indirect, sometimes it is structured, sometimes unstructured, sometimes semi-structured. Observation is also another method of data collection, instrument for data collection. Observation might be direct or indirect. You go to the hospital to observe the relationship between patients and doctors and nurses. Then you collect data yourself, directly. But sometimes this is not possible, or you are not allowed to, or for whatever reason. So you might plant a camera there, and the camera records the relationships, the interactions. That is indirect. One example of survey is called community survey. Community surveys. By community surveys, we mean surveys that deal with parameters of a community, like the community of doctors and patients, for instance. You're interested in collecting that kind of data. Or you are interested in the way that communication goes on in companies, for instance, in a car company. And so you collect your data there. Or you're interested in the employment of people in large factories. or you're interested in the relationship between students and professors at university, or you're interested in the relationship between staff in health services, right? These are examples of community surveys. There are also public opinion surveys. Public opinion surveys. Like these cameramen who walk in the streets on occasions, then they catch people in the street, they stop them to interview them. Yes, I talked about the structured, semi-structured, narrative interviews, right? So by public opinion surveys, we mean those surveys which happen in the street. And you're interested in learning about the opinions of the public. On some occasions, religious occasions, for instance, or on some national occasions, they usually, these interviewers from the mass media come to the street and they stop people and they talk to them about those festivals, about those religious occasions, and so on and so forth. That is for survey research. What was the second method of descriptive research? I mentioned, yes, exactly, opinions of people in the street about COVID. I mentioned 3 methods of descriptive research. Survey research. The second one was interrelational. Interrelational. Not intentional. Interrelational. Well, interrelational methods are methods of research which enable you to identify the relationships between variables, between parameters. I repeat myself. Interrelational methods of research are research methods that enable you to identify the relationship between parameters, between variables, right, in your research. So we are interested in investigating the relation among existing factors. And so you offer reasonable descriptions of different aspects of a phenomenon. Here I mention 4 interrelational methods. 4 interrelational methods. One is case studies. One is field studies. One is correlational, and one is causal comparative. So, case studies, field studies, correlational, causal comparison. First things first. Let's start with case studies. What is a case study? The second one, I said case studies, field studies, F-I-E-L-D, field studies. The third one is correlational, and the fourth one is causal comparative. So what is a case study? A case study is can be used to describe the characteristics of a specific subject. I said use the word participant, not subject. Yes, such as a person, group, event, organization. Yes. Yes, well, case studies are in fact intensive investigations of a social unit. By social unit, I mean one participant, a person. It might be a group. It might be an organization. So we call it a social unit. In case studies, the researcher attempts to observe changes in the behavior of the participants. Let me give you an example. For instance, Michael Halliday studied the developmental processes of language learning of his own son, Nigel. Or Zia Hosseini, while he was doing his PhD in England, was tracing the development of Persian and English in his own child in 1970s, I think. So you intensively study the process of language learning. All 24 hours of the day, you stay with the child, you record the child, you record whatever he or she says. You might even document her movements, his gestures, so on and so forth. Do you hear me? Please let me know. Right. So please check your own connections. A case study. So in a case study, you have to intensively study the participant. You spend a lot of time collecting your data. A case study is very straightforward. And you usually write it. You write your observations. And this writing of your observation is almost informal, conversational, because you don't want people to get tired of long explanations. So it's informal, it's conversational, straightforward. This is not true about quantitative research, for instance. But one characteristic of survey research is that you have no control over data. Sometimes you have to wait, 2 days, 3 days for the child to say one word. Right? So you have no control over the quantity of the data that is produced in your study. There is also this issue of chance. in in the findings that you obtain. Sometimes you obtain information by chance. So there is this, you have to be cautious not to make generalizations. Because if you make generalizations, you are going to extend it to other people, the results, I mean. But in case studies, we have to be very cautious not to make invalid generalizations. Case studies are different from survey research. How are they different? Right, you're right. How are case studies different from survey research? I said in case study, in survey research, we usually collect data from a large number of people. In case studies, you collect data from a specific participant, from a specific group, from a specific organization. So case studies are different from survey research in as much as in survey research, you deal with a large number of people. In case studies, you deal with a limited number of cases. So case studies are very narrow in scope. Very narrow in scope because you work with one individual, one company, one group of people. But they are exhaustive because you have to go to the depth of the study. You have to be very detailed. You have to be very intensive. So they're very exhaustive. And they're qualitative by nature. Yes, they deal with limited numbers. But as I pointed out, you cannot make generalizations. Alright, what about field studies? What are field studies? Do you have my voice? Please let me know if you hear me. Field. F-I-E-L-D. F-I-E-L-D. Yes, field studies. Like studies in agriculture. In agriculture, they have to go to the field and they have to collect their data in the field. Their data will have to do with botanies, have to do with plants, trees, grass, I don't know, even insects, so on. You can also see a hospital as a field, a school as a field. Yes. So the investigator directly goes to the field and observes naturally occurring events. Field research is very active. Why? I said field research requires a lot of activity because the researcher has to go to the place, has to observe people, has to record them. Then yes, he has to get back and write it down. He goes directly there and observes people. So field research is not passive. Field research is not retrospective. Field research is very active. Field research is prospective, progressive. And it is the good point, the positive point about field research is that you obtain valid information. But relationship between two or more variables. You wish to determine the degree of the relationship between two or more variables. We call them correlational. So you obtain numerical values on go togetherness of two variables, for instance. Positive correlation, there might be negative correlation. And there might be no correlation. For instance, you might be interested in the relationship between, say, here and the degree of talk time, the relationship between gender and the degree of talking time. You would like to know if men or women talk more, for instance, in language classes. There might be a relationship between gender and talking time in classes. It might be that men talk more or women talk more. Or your results might show that there is no difference. Or you might be interested in the relationship between language proficiency and the number of errors that students make. Language proficiency and the students' errors. You're interested in knowing whether less proficient learners make more errors or more proficient learners make less errors. Or, well, there might be no relationship between language proficiency and a number of Do you hear me? Please let me know you hear me. Right, thank you. Let me get back again. You might be interested in learning about students' midterm and final term examination. You might be interested in learning whether there is any correlation between those students who got good scores in midterm examination and the scores that they get in final term examination. There might be a connection. So those people who perform good in midterm might continue to perform good in final term, perform bad in final. Or the reverse. Those who performed good in midterm perform bad in final, but those who performed bad in midterm performed good in final. So you're interested in learning about the correlation, which indicates how consistent these students were all throughout the semester. We also, in research, we also have a method we call rate correlation. What is rate correlation? Have you heard rate correlation? R-A-T-E-R. We use rate correlation in text analysis, for instance. R-A-T-E-R. R-A-T-E-R. Rate correlation. Not W, I said right. Rater. Rater. R-A. Yes. Rate correlation. What is rate correlation? Well, by rate correlation, let me give you an example. Let us say you're going to score a paper in research. You're going to score a paper in research. I score it and I give it a score based on my interpretation. Another researcher might score it and give it a different score. A third researcher might score it and give it a third score. If that is so, then there is no consistency in the scores that the student receives. You're analyzing text for certain linguistic characteristics to extract certain linguistic characteristics from the text. 2 or 3 raters go over the text to identify those linguistic characteristics. If these people, these 2 or 3 people, identify different linguistic characteristics, then there is no consistency. Research requires consistency. So we do rate correlation to make sure that, our interpretation of a text remains consistent through one person to another person. So if 3 people analyze a text with certain linguistic criteria, certain linguistic features, then these 3 people should come to some sort of compromise, come to some sort of agreement right? This is called rate of correlation. All right, another method of research and survey research is causal comparative, I said. Causal comparative. What is causal comparative research? Causal comparative research. Well, they are different from experimental methods of research. They are different from experimental methods. You see, let me just explain what we mean by causal comparative. If I am doing text analysis, imagine I am interested in learning about nominals, for instance, nominals in academic texts. Nominals in academic texts. Well, I have collected some papers and I analyze these papers to see how nominals are used. Right? How nominals are used in academic texts. Here in this case, well, nominals have already been used by writers. They influence. They have their own impact or influence on readers. You identify those linguistic markers, nominals, for instance. They are the cause, but they have their own effect. So you cannot change these nominals because they have already been used in that text. They have their own effect. But this effect on people, effect on readers, effect on those people who read those papers. But this effect is caused by those nominals. Let me give you another example. Do you hear me? Please let me know if you hear me. Right. Thank you. Well, another example comes from, for instance, voice in newspapers. Voice in newspapers. Please check your connection because everybody says they hear me with no problem. Voice in newspapers. You know, in English we have two voices, active voice and inactive. Active and passive. Sometimes you write in active voice and sometimes you write in passive voice. Well, active and inactive. So you analyze text, analyze journalistic texts, newspaper texts, and then you see that a large number of passive voice is used. Well, passive voice, when used, will have their own impact on readers. Journalists do not invariably use active or passive constructions. They have reasons why they use active, why they use passive constructions. But you cannot change them because they have already been used. So in causal comparative studies, we deal with things like text analysis, in which the cause is the text that has already been produced, the data that has already been produced. The effect is the impact that it leaves on readers, for instance. So then, as a researcher, you identify these voices, active voices, passive voices, and then you try to offer reasons for why the researcher has used active voice, why the researcher has used passive voice. Right? So we determine, in causal comparative, we determine the reasons for the causes. We determine the reasons for why active voice here, why passive voice here, why nominal in this context, why nominal in that context. So we are after finding out effect, but they are different from experimental research, as I said. In experimental research, you are also after identifying cause and effect relationship. But in experimental research, you have the cause, you look for the effect. Like you say, the effect of listening comprehension on speaking ability. The effect of listening comprehension. Listening comprehension would be the independent variable. The effect of listening comprehension on the speaking ability. Speaking ability would be the dependent variable. But in causal comparative, the relationship is the reverse. You have the effect. You look for the causes. You have that language that is already produced. You have those voices, active voice, passive voice, that have already been produced. You look for causes. Why passive voice here? Why active voice there? In experimental research, we assign people to different groups randomly, and then you call it, I don't know, experimental group, control group. In causal comparative research, you do not form new groups. In fact, groups already exist. Groups already exist. Those textbooks already exist. Textbooks for analysis, for instance. We call this method of research also ex post facto. Ex post facto. EX space post facto, F-A-C-T-O, ex post facto. The problem with ex post facto is that, again, you have no control over variables. But this is not a problem. This is a problem for experimental methods of research. And another characteristic of ex post facto or causal comparative is that you cannot identify one reason for the cause. Why people use active construction, why people use passive construction, well, there might be different reasons. Why people use nominalization in academic texts, there might be different reasons. So there is no single reason for this, no single reason, in fact, for research. Yes, facto, F-A-C-T-O. All right, let me turn to another area in research, which is also very important, and that's got to do with data collection. I will start talking about data collection. I will talk about one of the factors and leave the other issues for the next session, because I don't want to make you tired. Well, once you have the problem, you have developed questions, you have developed hypotheses, then you have to go and collect your data. You have to obtain information on those variables. What do you need to obtain information? You need instruments. I said you might have interviews, you might have questionnaires, you might have observations, you might have tests, so on and so forth. You might have different kinds of tests. You might use pictures to collect your data. But before you collect your data, there are two very important issues to consider. Two very important issues to consider. One is sampling, one is ethics. One is sampling, one is ethics. Sampling in research and ethics in research. Another important issue is piloting. I will explain piloting and ethics in research, leaving sampling for the next session. So, in relation to data collection, there are very important issues to consider. One is sampling, one is ethics, one is piloting. What is piloting? P-I-L-O-T-I-N-G. It's not the entire group. In fact, it's parts of that group. Imagine, let me give you an example. Imagine you wish to do your study with 100 people. 100 people. Well, it would be very time consuming. It takes an awful amount